Greetings from Tokyo. This is Daisuke Beppu. How are all of you doing today? I am very thrilled and happy because today, if you'll let me, I would like to share with you some comments about a really fascinating and wonderful film. It is one of my favorites, and so I feel honored to be able to provide some comments on this film from the Criterion collection, spine number 11, The Seventh Seal. Spine number 11. This is the Blu-ray of The Seventh Seal, and what a great Blu-ray this is. So let me just show you here, and the back right there. And if we look, we see the disc inside and the booklet. The booklet is here, and it is very nice because you can see there are, of course, the essays, Gary Giddens' essay called There Go the Clowns, with some pictures and stills from the film itself, as well as a really nice discussion of this great film. And I would say that some of the points that are discussed in the essay form a nice supplement to the wonderful commentary which is on this. So let me just talk briefly about the supplements that are on the disc itself. So we've got an introduction by Bergman, recorded in 2003. We have an audio commentary by Peter Cowie with a new afterword. So this is really nice. Then we have Bergman Island, the 83-minute documentary. And then we have an audio interview with Max von Sydow, a 1989 tribute to Bergman by filmmaker Woody Allen. Bergman 101, a selected video filmography tracing Bergman's career, narrated by Peter Cowie. Bergman Island, which is one of the supplements, is actually its own separate spine number. It appears as a separate spine number on a DVD in the Criterion collection. So I will forego the discussion of Bergman Island, and I will wait until I reach that particular spine number. So with that in mind, let me say, as always, that I'm going to be talking about the film in some detail. So if you don't want to be spoiled, please, I suggest that you turn off this video and watch the film at your leisure. And when you have, and if you feel comfortable enough with the subject matter, please feel free to come back anytime. I'm always going to be here, and so I'm more than happy to discuss the film with you at that time. What is this film about, essentially? I mean, it's a film that is about the dilemma that is the silence of God, and I think more broadly than that, the dilemma with respect to whether or not God exists, and if God does exist, then why does he not show himself more directly? In other words, why does he allow for the suffering of man on earth? These are very fundamental questions in theology, and these are very fundamental questions in human philosophy. So it is quite a large it's quite a large item to deal with in a film that is 90 minutes or so, and I think it's a bit of an overwhelming and perhaps intimidating theme for a viewer like myself to be confronted with when trying to watch this particular film. But this is one of the great strengths of this particular film, The Seventh Seal. Instead of cloaking or couching this theme within the confines of, let's say, a very austere modern-day human drama, instead, what Bergman does is he gives us the story within the context of this knight who is coming back from the Crusades. So we are dealing with a very rich historical setting that is, at least from my point of view, very foreign from my understanding of my own environment. So therefore there is a sort of bit of a distance that is provided, which I think is very important because it doesn't call attention to the weight and the gravity of the theme that it's trying to tackle, namely how to deal with the silence of God. I think it really helps to, how should I put it, maybe buttress or maybe soften the otherwise grandiose theme that this film is trying to tackle. And I think that's a really good thing, and that's a positive thing, because it doesn't hit you over the head. It's not too direct, but it is trying to be told, or it's trying to tell its tale, or it's trying to deal with its theme through this really wonderfully indirect method of allegory, which I think is very important. So how does this film deal with this theme of let's say, the silence of God? Or maybe another way of describing it might be, perhaps there's the absence of God, or the lack of existence of a God, perhaps. So how does one see this theme played out in this film? I think directly it's played out in terms of how each of the characters is portrayed, and this is very important. First, we have the character of Jöns, played by Gunnar Bjornstrand, and he is very important because he provides the agnostic, or how should I say, the very practical, agnostic approach to this issue of suffering on earth. And he provides this in very heavy but I think healthy doses, and therefore he provides a certain counterpoint, which I think is very important, to the other main character of the film, who is Antonius Block, who is played by Max von Sydow. Now, Max von Sydow's character, Antonius, is approaching it from a different angle. So he seems to be believing in God, although he is apparently experiencing a crisis of faith as we meet him in the film. So as we later find out in his confession scene, and also in his discussions with Mia about God and about faith, we realize that he is struggling because he does not understand why God does not show himself if he truly does exist. And he is struggling with this because all around him he has been seeing death and decay and the unhappiness of man. He's come back from many years in battle in the Crusades, so we can only assume the kind of bloodshed and horror that he has had to witness. And plus, when we see him in the film, we realize that he is surrounded by death. There are dead bodies around the place. We later see him confronting the burning of a girl who is alleged to be a witch. So there's much suffering. And he himself apparently is trying to resolve or try to reconcile this very fundamentally deep dilemma that he's experiencing between this idea of how can he believe in God if God does not or is not willing to show himself before man and on earth through some kind of miracle or some kind of other means. And the lack of the presence of God is exemplified by the quote-unquote suffering of man. So here we have already two very important poles or counterpoints to each other. We have Jöns on the one hand, and we have Antonius Block on the other hand. And this battle between these two differing poles, this juxtaposition as it were, forms a really nice, dichotomy. Not only in terms of the character dynamic between the two, but also in terms of battling themes within the film itself and battling tones within the film itself. So if you know the film, you'll know that there are light moments of the film when we are talking about certain scenes involving let's say Yoff or Lisa and Plug and Scott and their little love trysts and little love escapades on the one hand. And then we also have darker elements as well. For example, the idea of the embodiment of death Bengt Ekerot and his very iconic depiction of death, or we have Antonius Bloch's Crisis of Faith and how he expresses that, or we have the images of death and destruction, the burning of the witch, the slashing of the face of Raval and his subsequent death at the hands of the sickness that is plaguing Europe. And these are all very deeply disturbing moments in the film. So the balance between these lighter moments and these darker moments, I think, is quite fascinating. And I think it goes to show that there are these maybe dueling poles or dueling visions, as it were, which is exemplified, I think, most primally and most squarely, directly between the kind of dueling views of the world as exemplified by Antonius Bloch on the one hand and Jons on the other. So it's a great total package of a film in that respect. Speaking of death, this is a very interesting point. We have the vision of death by Antonius Bloch, and we have, of course, then the setup, which is Death and Antonius playing chess and battling each other, and the idea being, or the conceit being, that Antonius Bloch has been targeted by death to be the next one to fall, but Antonius is trying to buy some time, and by doing, in order to do that, he is wanting to engage with death in this epic battle of chess. For the most part in the film, death is not necessarily directly associated with God or religion. Death is not a religious figure or a religious notion or concept, or in other words, a concept that is connected with or based in Christianity, at least in this iteration of death. So therefore, we have that very important moment when Antonius asks Death about the secret. What does he know? And Death does not respond, which is to suggest that Death itself is just as oblivious to the moral or the critical issue as to whether God exists, and if so, why is God silent? Death seems to be just as oblivious to this issue as Antonius is. So death seems to be a concept that is completely independent from the notion of God and God's existence, which is very, very important. But what makes this concept of death a little bit complicated, in my opinion, is this. So remember Yoff. So Yoff is the father and the husband, and his wife is Mia, and they are the traveling artists. And Yoff, we meet him early on in the film, and we are witness to him having a vision, and he interprets this. We see it in the distance. We see a woman playing with a child, and we think this is a vision, although we're not quite sure, actually, because we understand that Yoff tends to be a bit of a liar, but he goes to Mia, right, and he claims that he had a vision of Mary and the baby Jesus. Not quite sure how much we are meant to believe this to be actually the case. And I think there is some reasonable doubt that can be in the minds of the viewer like myself regarding whether he really does have this ability to see these really religious visions, or whether he is just imagining them in his own mind, or maybe he's mistaking something for something else, or something to that effect. But if we are to go along with the way that his character and Mia's character, both of them are positioned in the film, they seem to be positioned in a place of, let's say, moral sanctity and, for lack of a better phrase, a general human goodness. So if that is the case in terms of their character depictions, then I think we as the viewer, the audience, are meant to, or can be forgiven if we are inclined to take Yoff's word, namely that he does in fact see visions that are religious in nature. So on that basis, remember that he does see death along the way. He does have a vision of death and Antonius playing chess at one point, which then triggers him to want to leave. And then we do see him at the end, of course, with the famous vision of the dance of death, the dance macabre, as he sees death and the followers along the hillside in the distance, in that very famous shot. So if we are to take this to mean that he is having a vision of death, that is a true vision, then it's a very interesting thing, because we understood him to be one who has visions that are religious in nature. Taking the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus at the beginning to be the main example of this. But then if we are to take him also at his word, then what are we to make of these visions of death, right? So in fact, there could be a way in which death can be somehow linked with religion, at least in a broader sense, in terms of the allegory that can be possible by virtue of the character Yoff and the idea of him having quote unquote religious visions, right? How, if he has a religious vision of death, then that could allow one to make the conclusion that perhaps death does indeed have some kind of quote-unquote religious connection or connotation. So it's food for thought, I think. And I think also, though, that this theme of death and the role of death in religion, though, I think that, for me anyway, forms the core thesis of the film as I interpret it to be, in terms of how it resolves this issue of faith and the crisis of faith that is expressed by Antonius. So what do I mean by this? So remember that Antonius is having this crisis of faith, and how does he put it? He says that early on, he says that he has cut himself off from men, so that he is left alone with his thoughts, and therefore he feels teased, and he can't shake off the notion of God, but he is frustrated because God does not show himself. And he has that very famous quote later when he's talking to Mia, faith is a heavy burden. It's like loving someone out in the darkness who never comes, no matter how loud you call. How unreal that all seems now with you and your husband, he then says. So this is very interesting, right? Because he is, in a sense, relieved by the company that is being given to him by Mia and Yoff. So this is, I think, the core conclusion of the film as I interpret it, right? Namely that the idea of the crisis of faith and the absence, or not absence of God, but the silence of God is resolved or can be reconciled by the goodness of man. And in particular, it is resolved by Antonius, I would argue, by the fact that he does commit a good deed. And I think that good deed can be interpreted to be the act that he does in allowing this young couple to escape the clutches of death while he is still engaged in the chess match. So this is Antonius's response to death, right? Which is a very interesting thing, right? He responds to death. He is in the face of death, and he knows he's going to die, but rather than be alone with his thoughts and isolated from man, as he describes himself early in the film, he instead does something that is, I think, the ultimate expression of a connection with another human being. Namely, he saves this young couple. And that's what he does in the face of death. And so therefore we see him as one of the travelers and followers of death in the dance macabre in the distance, which is the vision of Yoff. And so therefore, this vision of Yoff of death, showing Antonius now in the clutches of death, is basically the result of Antonius and his good deed in the face of death. So you can say therefore that the good deed is almost like his way of of doing good. And this idea of doing good can be a way of reconciling this idea of the silence of God. Namely, God is no longer silent because good deeds do in fact occur in this world of humanity, which is, I think, a very powerful message, because instead of having this, this God in the sky or in heaven, wherever, God becomes something or someone that is within us or between us, as kinds of feelings or notions of devotion and wanting to help, and this becomes a very important, I think, aspect of Bergman and his approach to this notion of the silence of God in his other works. How does God manifest himself in the acts of man, in the intimate acts of man, and in the way human beings interact with one another? I think that's the core here. And this is what is being done through allegory, admittedly, of course, but this is what's being done here with respect to Antonius and his sort of sacrifice, if you will, for the sake of others around him. I just get a real thrill. I get a real thrill and chill whenever I see death on screen and Antonius Bloch talking with death on screen. That's just the most iconic thing in cinema, and they're talking about God. Can you imagine it? A knight from the Crusades is talking to death, and their discussions are with respect to God, it's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing. Only in cinema can that be so perfectly encapsulated. And it's great too, right? Because whenever there is supposed to be a priest on screen, right, we never see a priest. It's always death. It's always death pretending to be the priest or standing in the place of the priest. That's also a very interesting point. So does that also suggest something about the absence of God on the one hand, or death's connection with the religious aspect of priests? So does that mean that death inherently has some kind of religious bent or religious connotation? Who knows? Much to think about. My goodness, the seventh seal. I can't stop. Okay, but I have to stop because that's the nature of this YouTube video. But if you have any questions or comments about this wonderful, wonderful film, one of my favorite films ever, then please feel free to leave them below. I'll be more than happy to address them to the best of my ability. My friends, Ingmar Bergman, one of the greats, and The Seventh Seal is perhaps one of his greatest films, is it not? My goodness, I love this film so much. I think I'm gonna, after I stop this video, I'm gonna put this in the machine and watch it again, actually. So in the meantime, my friends, please join me next time, for I will be talking about spine number 12, which I believe is This Is Spinal Tap. So until then, my friends, I hope you are well and happy and healthy, and you are watching a lot of great, great films. Take care, my friends. Cheers.